Howdy, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the House of St. Rainey podcast. As always, I'm excited to share. This week's episode, we are going to be discussing Christianity a little bit. Specifically, we're going to be discussing how the Bible is meant to be interpreted. I have recently discovered in the last couple years that it seems to me like the Bible has been misinterpreted for a long time, and it's time for a new reformation. And when we learn how to properly read and interpret the Bible, we truly see ultimate truth shining through. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we dive into it, just a quick shout out to my sponsor, my book, Finding God, Losing God, Becoming God. I'm a full-time independent author. I've dedicated my entire life to sharing the truth of unconditional love, the unity consciousness, with as many people as possible. This book is a tool that I have created to help people do that, to see the truth of God outside of religion, to see the truth of who they are, and really awaken a whole new capacity for unconditional love for self and others equally. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend purchasing it. It's a pretty good book, if I do say so myself. A lot of really good reviews so far. I'm so grateful to be able to share this with other people, and to hear that it has positive impact on people's lives is really a source of tremendous gratitude for me. So the Bible and how it is meant to be interpreted. For some people, this might be a really interesting topic. For others, it might be a little bit more of a snooze fest. I totally understand. I do think that this is highly important for everyone, because if you're on the spiritual journey, there is truth to be found in the Bible. I don't believe that you need it, but it is a source of truth, and it can certainly guide you. You can discover truth through different means. You know, you could take a more Eastern approach and you can discover ultimate truth through Buddhism or any number of avenues. You could even discover truth through science and studies of consciousness and things of that nature. But as I have deconstructed out of a 30-year Christian faith that includes higher education at a Bible school and time spent as a teaching pastor, I have deconstructed out of Christianity, but in really reflecting on the Bible, specifically who Jesus is, and understanding how to interpret the Bible as it is intended, is highly illuminating, and most definitely, I believe most definitely, can serve everyone, not just Christians or former Christians, but everyone. A little brief context before we get into how to properly interpret the Bible. As I've mentioned on this podcast before, you probably know that I went to Moody Bible Institute, a private Christian school, and I studied hermeneutics. I studied how to properly read and interpret scripture, something I was so excited to do when I got to college. And for the entire time spent in my life as a Christian, I really interpreted the Bible through the Protestant lens, through that kind of interpretation. The Protestant interpretation of the Bible, it is completely aware of, and it recognizes that there are different genres within the Bible, of course. There are narratives, there are stories of people going through different life events and things of that nature, where there's literally characters and there's a plot that unfolds, there's a narrative. But then there's Psalms and Proverbs, there's wisdom literature, there's law, there's all these different kinds of genre. And so it's really important to read those different books of the Bible, understanding the genre that you're reading. And so for my entire Christian life, that was kind of my framework. It was kind of like, okay, I'm reading about Jesus right now. That is a narrative that's unfolding, and you read it within the context. You read it in the context of the entire Bible, but then also you read it in context of what's happening in this scene, right? If it's a narrative, what's happening? Where's Jesus coming from? What's Jesus up to? What's he teaching? How does it fit into the whole life and teachings of Jesus and all of these sorts of things? Broadly speaking, let me cut right to the chase here. Broadly speaking, I've really come to understand that The Protestant way of reading and interpreting the Bible is very similar to reading an ancient newspaper. It's just like it's reading it as literal history. And when you read it in that way, you get a certain outcome. Let's just stick with the story of Jesus here for a little bit. When you read the story of Jesus, like an ancient newspaper, like it's literally just documenting what he did, the exact words he said, his miracles, etc. And when you read it as like historical reportage, you will get a certain kind of spiritual truth. And you will get a different kind of life application. And that is going to produce the Protestant view of Jesus, which really is Jesus is God's one and only Son. He lived a perfect life as fully human and fully God. He taught the way to the Father is through himself alone, through Jesus, the person, and that if you trust in his death and resurrection, that you will be saved, and that is the exclusive path to salvation. All other gods are false. All other sacred texts are false. You trust in God's authoritative word is the Bible alone. And you can restore your relationship with God through Jesus alone. And if you do not have restored relationship, if you do not receive forgiveness for your sins through the exclusive life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, then you're going to hell. That's the traditional Protestant interpretation. That's what you get when you read the Bible as an ancient newspaper. Now, when I was going on my spiritual journey, my conscious awakening journey, I had this feeling of like, I didn't really want to read the Bible anymore. I felt like I spent the majority of my life reading the Bible and I needed to explore other texts. I needed to explore other writings from other people, maybe other sacred texts, but then also other just books to read. So I kind of lost my interest in like diving into the Bible. But one thing too is I lost my belief that it is God's exclusive authoritative word. So I put the Bible kind of on the shelf there for a while I was reading books and exploring the world of consciousness. And I was reading about different modes of spirituality and understandings that all kind of funneled me in the direction of non-duality or oneness, which is what I see and know and feel is the ultimate truth. On that journey of exploring other thinkers and other books, I came across Joseph Campbell, who is now by far and away, there's not even a close second, by far and away my favorite author. His books, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, Thou Art That is my favorite book. So if you're interested in this podcast episode and you haven't read Thou Art That, that is a must read, in my opinion. It's my favorite book. Joseph Campbell, if you don't know, and this is actually the thing, in Christian circles, at least in my own personal experience, I had never heard of Joseph Campbell in my life. And in terms, just a little side note, in terms of non-duality or the truth of oneness, that is also something that I hadn't really considered much as a Christian. In all the apologetics videos that I watched on YouTube, all the apologetics and theology books that I've read, no one really discusses non-duality all that seriously. All the apologetics debates and all the Christian theologians, they really focus on why Christianity is the way as opposed to atheism, why Christianity is the truth and not Islam, or these sorts of things. But no one really focuses a whole lot on non-duality. At least I never encountered it. And as a Christian, I never heard of Joseph Campbell before. Now, Joseph Campbell, his books they're not like books on non-duality. They're not books on oneness. They're books on mythology. If you don't know, Joseph Campbell was one of, if not humanity's greatest, most well-renowned, respected mythologists in human history that I'm aware of. And I've been researching this. I don't know of any other human who was a mythologist that is as renowned as Joseph Campbell. So his books, like I said, they're not on non-duality. They're not on the truth of oneness. They're exploring mythology and the power of mythology. Briefly, like there's mythologies, there's these stories that are told throughout history. Every people group, every tribe, every society have constructed these mythologies that have these particular functions. They teach the individual about it. It gives the individual a sense of awe for the cosmos, a reverence for the cosmos, perhaps looking towards a higher power. It presents a situation for the individual that gets them to reflect on their own life and how to overcome certain challenges and what their own journey looks like, the hero's journey, story arc, right? These mythologies have this story arc, and they're teaching the people of that culture that has this mythology. The mythologies have these particular functions that serve the individual, it serves the community. It gives them a structure, an understanding of purpose of life, how to overcome challenges, what you're here to do, etc. Joseph Campbell was very intimately aware of and had the knowledge of, like every mythology out there, from, like prehistoric, tribal, early humanity mythology from all over the world. It truly is fascinating to read his works. So he dissects, he examines, he investigates all these different mythologies, and amazingly, it's so spectacular that all of these mythologies generally follow a similar story arc, this hero's journey stories arc. It doesn't matter if it's from people from Australia to North America to Africa to Europe. It doesn't matter where the mythology comes from. They share this similar story arc. And so Joseph Campbell, in his works, like his most famous is A Hero with a Thousand Faces. There's also The Power of Myth. He's really demonstrating how all of these mythologies are fashioned to tell you a spiritual story. Thou Art That is particularly relevant to this episode because that's where he really examines and looks at the Bible as a mythology. And that is why I'm bringing him up in this episode right now. The world's greatest mythologist says that the Bible is a mythology. It has been read and interpreted as an ancient newspaper for 1,500 plus years. And that gives you certain spiritual truths. Joseph Campbell suggests, and I totally agree with, that the Bible is actually a mythology, which means it's meant to be read through a metaphorical framework that reveals the highest spiritual truths. There's two different ways to read the Bible: ancient newspaper, mythology, or a spiritual story. These different interpretations give you different outcomes. Reading it as an ancient newspaper will give you something like Protestantism. Interestingly, when you read it like a mythology and you read it through the metaphorical framework, you see Christ consciousness. You see oneness. You see oneness in the Garden of Eden story. You see the human condition unfolding throughout the entire Old Testament and how these different characters are going on their own hero's journey, but every single one of those characters is in you. Whether it's Abraham, Moses, Jacob, they're in you. David, Daniel, Jonah. These are all archetypes. These are all characters that are in you, and they're teaching you a story through their hero's journey. And then you get to Jesus. You get to the hero who came here to teach humanity, to save humanity from their own self, to restore them to unity with the Father, to discover the kingdom through surrendering your worldly sense of self. Again, you read it as an ancient newspaper, you get, I need to believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and that alone saves my soul. I get to go to a geographic location, heaven, and I avoid the geographic location of hell. That's reading it very literally, like a historical document. Reading it spiritually, like as a spiritual story, it gives you a different picture. You look at the teachings of Jesus and you start to understand that oneness with the Father is oneness. That is spirit. That is the truth. The Father is a representation of the truth of unity. The path to unity is Christ, which is not a human. It's a level of consciousness that is heart-centered. It sees others as your own self, just as Jesus saw himself in the least of these. It allows you to live a life of non-judgment. It empowers you to miraculous forgiveness. The way to the Father, the way, the truth, and the life is Christ. That is heart-centered level of consciousness that views all as one. It's a heart of compassion. That is the direct path to unity consciousness. This is the difference in interpreting the Bible as an ancient historical document versus reading it symbolically. Now, I'm not going to go through all the stories of Jesus in this episode. I do cover a lot of teachings and miracles in my book, Finding God, Losing God, Becoming God. I do march through a lot of the significant teachings and events of Jesus and how, and I lay this out in my book where you see the literal interpretation versus the symbolic interpretation. But the purpose of this episode is really just to reveal that the way that the Bible is intended to be interpreted is as a spiritual story, not as an ancient historical document. By the way, I'm agreeing with the world's greatest mythologist, right? So if John Rainey says, the Bible is a mythology. It's meant to be read through a metaphorical framework that reveals the symbols of higher truth. It's kind of like, who cares what John Rainey says? Really what I'm doing is I'm agreeing with humanity's greatest mythologist, or one of humanity's greatest mythologists, who says, the person who is most acquainted with mythologies says, the Bible is a mythology. It's intended to be read as a mythology. It's plain as day. You see the hero's journey and all these different characters. Of course, there's so many different events in the Bible that are not credible history. It's mythology. That doesn't make it insignificant. It's highly significant. There's spiritual truth all over the Bible. That's why this episode is important for everyone, not just Christians and non-Christians. There's higher truth all over the Bible, but you see it through the metaphor. That reveals the symbol of higher spiritual truth. One thing that is really important to note is really considering, again, let's focus on Jesus, because Jesus is really the most important part, or at least is the point of greatest interest to me. And I'd venture to guess many listeners and viewers. Who was Jesus then? If the Bible's a mythology, it's meant to be read as a metaphor, does that mean that Jesus didn't exist? No, not at all. There are people throughout history who historians agree and believe were real historical figures, but mythology is applied to their story. Different fantastic events that are applied to real historical people. That's meant to teach, it's meant to encourage, it's meant to inspire. So for example, Alexander the Great, Confucius. These are two examples of people that historians agree were real people, but they both have mythology attached to their story. That doesn't mean that it voids the significance of their story. It inspires, it encourages, it teaches. We need to view these things not so hardline, not so rigid, but how can this impact my own life? What does this mean for me? But the point that I'm making here is that everyone knows that Alexander the Great was a real person, but his story includes miraculous birth stories and encounters with mythological creatures. Confucius, again, a real historical figure that has a divine birth story, unbelievable wisdom in his youth. I believe there's also, with Confucius, encounters with mythological figures. There's also the founders of other religions, Siddhartha Gautama of Buddhism, Again, historians agree this was a real person, mythology attached to his story. Same with Muhammad, same with Zoroaster. There are real historical figures, mythologies attached to their name. That doesn't void the spiritual significance of their story, but I do believe that whether we're talking about Siddhartha Gautama, we're talking about Muhammad, Zoroaster, or Jesus, we need to view them as real historical figures, but their story is crafted in such a way that is to inspire us, to reveal a higher awe of the cosmos, to see these spiritual principles, to look inward. How is Christ and the story of Christ found within me? And same with Siddhartha, same with Zoroaster, same with Muhammad. How is the Buddha within, the Christ within, how does this impact me in my everyday life challenges? The story of Jesus, you can look at the hero's journey story arc of Jesus, and you see all these different things that he was able to accomplish. Now, again, it's not readily credible history, the miracles and the things that he participated in. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. When you understand the Bible's mythology, it's meant to be read through a metaphorical framework that reveals the symbols of higher truth. It doesn't matter if what was written about Jesus, it doesn't matter if it happened or if it didn't happen. The truth remains the same. So, for example, you look at the miracles of Jesus. Did he really turn water into wine? Did he really feed 5,000 people from just a small basket of food? Did he really open the eyes of the blind? And did he really calm the storms? It doesn't matter whether or not Jesus performed the miracles, because it's a story that is meant to reveal a higher spiritual truth. So what I think is really beautiful about this way of interpreting scripture is you can maintain the belief that he was a miracle worker. I, for one, fall in that category. I actually do believe that Jesus performed these miracles. I'll talk about that in a second. But you don't need to believe that he did these things. The truth is found in the spiritual symbol. It's reading it as a spiritual story and seeing the symbol. Now, I want to discuss where symbol meets power. I talk about this in my book as well. Do I believe that Jesus performed these miracles? I do, and here's why. In all of my research and studying and reading about consciousness, when you elevate your level of consciousness, your entire life experience changes. Now, this goes beyond just reading and researching. I've felt this firsthand. When you live in those lower levels of consciousness, like fear and shame and guilt and anger and desire and pride, that's a very overwhelmingly heavy experience. It's a very unpleasant experience. It is hell. This is the Gehenna that Jesus speaks of. Hell is not a geographic location. It's living in fear. It's living just completely controlled by desire or like overwhelmed by grief. That is hell. When you live in that state, it's a very heavy experience. It's very detached from the truth of who you are. You have such a limited awareness of who you are when you're in those lower states. You're very consumed and focused on yourself and the woes of your life. You're focused on what you are afraid of and all these sorts of things. It's no judgment. It's just what you're here to experience. But it's a very heavy experience, and it's very detached from the higher levels of consciousness, of experiencing sustained love, joy, and peace with yourself and at harmony with everyone else. When you elevate your level of consciousness, I've talked in this podcast before about the map of consciousness of David Hawkins. When you raise your level of consciousness to those higher levels, you actually begin to experience, first of all, it's a lighter kind of experience. It's a much more enjoyable, pleasant, preferable kind of experience. When you raise your level of consciousness, your awareness is more expanded towards the truth, towards ultimate truth, which is pure consciousness. It is unity consciousness. Or as Jesus would say, this is oneness with the Father. This is maximal power. This is infinite awareness. This is total abundance. You see that spiritual reality play out in the life of Jesus. When he produces these miracles of feeding 5,000 people from a small basket of food, he's demonstrating a spiritual reality that is much more aware and expanded and close to the ultimate truth, which is omnipotence, abundance. Okay? Love and compassion for everyone. When you reach those higher levels of consciousness, what I'm really saying is there is real power. There's very real power. Now, again, I've read about it, but I've also experienced it myself, as I've discussed in previous episodes about miracles that I've experienced, transmuting maximal anger and resentment to supreme love, which I say is compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, and love. I was able to transmute maximal resentment and trauma into supreme love in 40 minutes, in a 40-minute walk. I have a whole episode on it. That's power. That's real power. The ability to love everyone without judgment, the ability to forgive others who have hurt you tremendously, that's real power. So would Jesus have been able to perform these miracles? I do believe in all likelihood he could have performed these miracles because of higher levels of consciousness produces very real power. I've personally experienced, but now I'm not equating myself to the level of consciousness that Jesus was at, but even me, what I'm saying is even in a few short years of conscious spiritual evolution, I've experienced relational miracles, able to transmute resentment into supreme love. I've experienced physical miracles of healing my epiretinal membrane, vision issue where I was seeing double, but now I see clearly. If I can do that, if my spiritual evolution can produce that in my life, what Jesus would have been able to do is probably extraordinary. But the beauty of reading the Bible as a mythology is you don't need to believe in the miracles because the truth is found in the symbols of the story. Now, here's where Christian theologians would really challenge me. You're not supposed to read your own beliefs into the Bible. This is the traditional approach. But what I have found is when you discover the truth of non-duality, when you discover the truth of oneness, and you understand that Jesus was teaching unconditional love through unity consciousness, then you can see the symbols so much clearly. You know, I read the Bible for 30 years and I didn't see the higher truth of non-duality. I didn't see Christ consciousness. But then once I discovered Christ consciousness, now I can read the story, the teachings, and everything associated with Jesus so much more clearly. So when you understand that all is one, when you understand that you and I are simply different individual expressions of the exact same spirit, and that unconditional love is the direct path towards truth, that a determination to express unconditional love for self and for all others, that leads you to the path of non-judgment. It leads you to a path of experiencing the energy of supreme love, unconditional love through unity consciousness. This is what Jesus was teaching. When you understand what Jesus was teaching, then you can read the story so much more clearly. To wrap this up, the Bible is a mythology that has been read like an ancient newspaper, and that gives you the story of the story of salvation that you get from Protestant doctrine or Catholic, etc. The Bible, when you understand that it's meant to be read as a mythology, you read it through the metaphorical framework, and then you have this freedom that reveals the spiritual symbols. You see the Christ and the Antichrist are within you. You see all the different characters throughout the gospel. They're all characters within you. And when you understand that, you can apply the spiritual truths to your life far more clearly and more profoundly. Reading the story of Jesus with understanding that he's teaching unconditional love through unity consciousness, you can apply these truths and understand them throughout all of his teachings, all of his miracles, the crucifixion, the resurrection, etc. You don't need to believe that these events actually happened, though I do. I do believe that they happened. I just don't insist that they happened. It doesn't matter in terms of the truth that you gain from reading it metaphorically. Reading it as a mythology does not mean that Jesus didn't truly exist. It's just simply understanding it as a spiritual story. And that is a very, very powerful, profound way to read the Bible and understand the spiritual truths that were intended to be communicated. The truth that Jesus was intending to communicate, that the way to the Father is through Christ. Unconditional love, the unity consciousness, is the way back to the realization that we are all one. We are all spirit having individual experiences. This is the truth of Jesus that you get from the Bible when you read it as a mythology through the metaphorical framework. I hope that this episode was really helpful for you. If you found this interesting or insightful to any degree, I would really appreciate a follow, subscribe, a 5-star review, etc. All of that greatly helps. I extend all my peace and blessings to you, and I will see you next week on the House of St. Rainey podcast.